Welcome back to the channel. This is Wes. There are two things that absolutely eat Tom King up inside at night. Number one, when people talk about Batman and the history of Batman and what you have to go read to understand who Batman is and what the character means and all that stuff, despite writing more issues than any other writer of Batman, I think that's what Tom King says, no one will ever say you need to read Tom King's Batman. More likely, people are going to say you should skip Tom King's Batman, read Scott Snyder's Batman, go read the Alan Moore Batman stuff, the Denny O'Neil Batman stuff, the Jerry Conway Batman stuff, the Chuck Dixon, Doug Mink, all those great writers that have worked on Batman for so long and done so many great things with the character that really defines who he is and what Batman means in the DC Comics universe. Tom King doesn't own one page of what defines Batman. The other thing that absolutely eats him up inside is that he's not Alan Moore. Case in point, during a recent interview at San Diego Comic-Con, Tom King said, "It's been 35, 40 years since the Killing Joke. Can we do it again? Can we find a Killing Joke for the Riddler?" Before that, the Joker was a fun character. He was funny. Neil Adams had redone him pretty well. Marshall Rogers had redone him pretty well, but he wasn't what he became afterwards, a killer of the DCU. Can we do that to Riddler? Can we make him as important, as big, as frightening as the Joker is? And subsequently, make me, Tom King, be as important as Alan Moore in the history and annals of not just Batman, but comic books in general? The answer is no. After reading Batman One Bad Day, Riddler #1, it's a resounding no. Because everything that Alan Moore is as a creator, Tom King is not. Alan Moore is able to take things that already exist. He's able to work within the context of who they are, add layers to them, recontextualize the character, and have something that feels fresh and new, but does not violate the essence of what the character is. Tom King is completely incapable of doing that, and he's proven that year after year at DC Comics, specifically on Batman, but with Mr. Terrific and a lot of other examples as well. This is another example. This is supposed to be a definitive Riddler story. And it's not, because it does not feel like Riddler at all. Just some of the blather that Tom King puts in this comic book about Riddler it's just over the top ridiculous. I don't even want to get into it. But what this comic book says about Batman definitively says that Tom King should never write the character again, which we knew already from his run on Batman and Batman Catwoman. He did have a decent story there in Killing Time, but this is much more like the Tom King that we know. This comic book, while technically well written and very well illustrated, this is probably the best artwork I've seen for Mitch Gerrits in 5 or 6 years. This is a really well illustrated comic book and technically well written. The problem is Riddler's been around for 80 years, and so is Batman, and that's why this thing fails so hardcore. Let's get into the comic book and why I dislike it so much. This thing is essentially torture porn. There's nothing redeeming or enjoyable about this comic book. We open up and there's a random man named John Oates talking to his wife about what they're going to do with their daughter, and he's leaving work, and it's done from a POV perspective. And when he walks out, the Riddler walks right up behind him in broad daylight and just blows his head off in front of everybody, in front of these security cameras, and just waits for the police to come get him. It's a Riddler that we've never seen before. There are no riddles or puzzles involved in this murder itself. Edward Nygma is taking a stand to become something that he's never been, because Tom King needs to put a stamp on Batman and the Riddler. We get this weird interrogation scene with Commissioner Gordon, and while I do like the art from Mitch Gerrits in this comic book quite a bit, Gordon looks a little bit too much like Colonel Sanders from KFC for my taste. We get this interrogation. The Riddler is no longer doing riddles, and we find out that Riddler is the one that provided Joker with the plan to kidnap Barbara Gordon and all the things that went down in the Killing Joke, because Tom King has to retcon an Alan Moore story to try and become the next Alan Moore. And he does weave in other events from Gordon's life as commissioner of Gotham City. And we start learning more about Riddler as a kid. Apparently, he is the product of a very, very not nice father who apparently had relations with a prostitute. Edward Nygma was born out of that. His father was ashamed of it. His son was scored and tested to be some type of genius. He gets him admitted into the school that he's the headmaster of, and he got a 92 on a test because there's a riddle at the end of it that he wasn't prepared for. And of course, he gets beaten with a book because of that, because fathers are terrible and they must be the root of all evil within DC Comics, according to Tom King. It doesn't stop there. He actually goes and confronts his teacher. I believe his name is Professor Yellen, something like that. And he's trying to be a mentor of sorts to Edward Nygma as a young man, but really he's just torturing him by putting these riddles on the test, which he knows he's going to get punished for because he doesn't know the answer to the riddle. At one point, of course, it's a Tom King story, so the kid decides he's going to kill himself. Thankfully, the gun isn't loaded, but he ends up bending over and calling his father and telling him to come and beat him and stuff. Just really over-the-top stuff that you would expect a Tom King depressed-ass writer to throw into a comic book. Eventually, the boy that will become Riddler confronts Yellen on a basketball court. The professor explains, I know that you cheated on the last test because I told a riddle that I wasn't planning to. I changed it the last second and you answered it as if it was the original riddle. I'm going to have to tell your father, the headmaster, you're going to get kicked out. This is all for the best. You need to learn to start being more carefree. Of course, he doesn't know that this child is a victim of abuse of his father. And the Riddler has his first victim. He ends up killing this man on the basketball court. The Riddler also discovers his mother at a later time and murders her because he's the most sociopathic murderer in the history of DC Comics, even more violent and deadly than Joker, of course. He's essentially Hannibal Lecter in Tom King's mind. He's obviously in jail after being interrogated by Commissioner Gordon for murdering that man in plain daylight. And he ends up convincing Burt Weston, a character we don't see all that often in DC Comics these days, to kill himself in his own jail cell because he was able to answer some pop culture trivia or whatnot. Because now that Tom King has decided he's writing the Killing Joke for the Riddler, he is the most diabolical, smartest villain in the history of all villains. At one point, they're going to take him into the courtroom to go before the judge. Riddler has to do absolutely nothing. Just speaking a few words, he convinces 7 members of the GCPD to just start murdering each other all in front of him while Gordon sits there helplessly and Batman does nothing, of course, because Batman is completely afraid and incapable of doing anything about the Riddler because he is now the most diabolical, dangerous, sociopathic villain in the history of DC Comics because Tom King just all of a sudden decided that he is this way. And finally, Batman agrees to Gordon. He said, you know what? I will go into the courtyard of the prison and talk to the Riddler since he wants to talk to me so bad. Apparently, that's why he killed this man. And we get like 7 of the most pretentious, lame-ass pages in the history of Riddler in DC Comics. And it's just Riddler talking about how smart he is, how he's always been one step ahead of Batman, about how he always knew that he was Bruce Wayne. He knew about Dick Grayson. He knew about Jason Todd. He knew about Tim Drake. He knows about Damian. He knows about Stephanie Brown. He knows about Cassandra Cain. He breaks into Wayne Manor on a regular basis and checks out all the things that are there. One time he stole a $1 bill just because this entire time, while Batman's been kicking the Riddler's ass for the last 80 years, he was letting him do it. He was all just part of his diabolical plan where he was using riddles to basically hamstring himself, so the Batman would have a fair chance going toe-to-toe with the Riddler, not physically, but mentally. And it's all just repugnant, pretentious bullshit, especially at the end of this thing. So Batman is taking all this, and he lets Batman know, if you ever touch me again, I'm just going to randomly kill people every single day. Anytime you put a finger on me, I'm just going to kill somebody. I'm not even going to kill somebody you love. And the blood of that father or husband or mother or daughter or son is going to be on your hands, and you better never touch me again. And Batman, a man of action, right? He's a hero. Batman will do absolutely nothing about it. In fact, Riddler tells him, I have a car on the other side of that gate. I'm going to walk out of it. I'm going to escape prison, and you're going to let me do it, and there's nothing you can do about it. Guess what Batman does? Absolutely nothing. He just lets this homicidal maniac, who apparently has no strings attached anymore, he doesn't have to do riddles anymore, he can just go out and murder with impunity throughout Gotham, and Batman does absolutely nothing. Because in Tom King's mind, Batman is a coward, apparently. He's not a man of action. He's not a hero. And of course, this is all going towards the end that the Riddler really wants to see if he could make Batman kill him, right? Can he solve the final riddle of how do you get Batman to break his one rule that he won't murder people? And of course, there are lots of consequences for the people in Gotham. And I don't just mean the citizens. I'm talking about everybody. The police, the other criminals, everyone is at the mercy of the Riddler. Listen to this stuff. It is so over-the-top ridiculous that you can't take any of this story seriously. At least I can't. I try to put officers outside the hotel standard just to stake it out, and they refuse the duty. They say he's going to kill their families. I went out there myself once, just parked across the street to see if he went out for the night or anything. Got a call from Barbara the next day, crying, someone poisoned her cats. I didn't tell her. She'll probably figure it out. I actually called the governor about bringing out the guard, just with my guys being a little unresponsive. He told me his son's been missing for a week. Then he hung up. The head of the United Bank of Gotham just put out a memo. Don't know if you heard about it. Says if Edward Nygma walks into any branch, he can have whatever he wants, no resistance or even reporting of the theft. It's not just this side of the law. Heard the 5 families had an emergency meeting after the wives of all 5 heads were killed. Wasn't much debate. Decision was, don't touch Nygma. And if he asks for help, give it to him. Hearing the same from the crazies. All those guys used to laugh at Riddler. He was a joke. Now they're all in awe of him. Oh, wow. They're just in awe of Riddler and everything that he's doing. Now listen to this. Maxie Zeus surrendered this morning. He said he wasn't a god anymore. And then he carved a question in his forehead. And of course, this leads to the moment of the story that you have to have, because Tom King wants this to be the definitive Riddler story in the history of DC Comics. Batman decides he's going to have to break his no-killing rule and sneaks up behind Riddler and apparently murders him in the end. The problem with Tom King at DC Comics, or his biggest problem, I guess, is the 80 years of history that preceded him there, and that's why nothing that he writes feels organic or true to the universe or the characters, because technically he is constricted to what has been laid out before him, and he has to work within that system. That's what separates Tom King from Alan Moore. Alan Moore can work within your stupid little system, and he can spit out something that is both new, original, and fresh, but also within the context of the character that is already there in design. He did it with Swamp Thing in a way that is quite unimaginable these days within comic books, to have that level of creativity and storycraft to be able to reimagine the origin of Swamp Thing, but make it make sense within the history of Swamp Thing that already existed. Tom King wants to believe that he's Alan Moore, but really he's just Chuck Austin. He's just a writer making really shitty Edge Boy fanfic stories. That's why they don't fit in the DC Comics universe. He's destroyed so many characters at this point, and this feels like the last nail in the grave of Batman when it comes to Tom King. The way that he is characterized and all the things that Batman allows the Riddler to do in here, and essentially does nothing until the very end when he breaks his primary rule, right? No killing. Wow, what a wonderful story. You really left your stamp, your goddamn mushroom stamp on Batman, Tom King. This is about $8 and 35 minutes of my life that I wish I had back, quite frankly, and I feel that way a lot of times when Tom King writes Batman. It's been that way for a very long time. Where did this all go wrong? Where did it go off the rails for Tom King and Batman? I actually talked about this a couple of years ago. Definitely watch this video if you haven't seen it and see where Tom King really lost the plot when it came to Batman.